So last week when I mentioned that we were going to be hanging out in Deuteronomy for a little bit, I could feel the fear and trepidation that Jim expressed in the room. And I want to assure you that I completely understand that feeling. You see, in seminary, the text depth class that I took was about Deuteronomy. Now, I can promise you that that is not the class that I would have picked. Like, if I could have opened up the Bible and chosen one of the books that I wanted to spend an entire class studying, I would not have picked Deuteronomy. But that was the only class that was offered at that time that would fit the requirement for what I needed to graduate. And so I spent an entire quarter just in Deuteronomy. But I ended up learning a lot, and I found some new and interesting insights in this book. One of the reasons that I love the Old Testament is that this book covers, the books cover a very long period of time. And they were also written and edited by people over a very long period of time. And these people lived through different things, different experiences, and that kind of comes through in the writing. So in the Hebrew Bible, we really get to witness people wrestling with God. Who is God? God is conceived in very different ways depending on which portion of Scripture that we are reading, which is why Deuteronomy kind of scares us. Deuteronomy contains some very, very challenging things. And the God of Deuteronomy, the God that appears on the pages in Deuteronomy, sounds so harsh, so punishing, and angry. So I'm sure you might be wondering, well, why on earth then are we starting there? I thought that since it's the beginning of my time here, I thought it would be a really good idea if we just laid down the law. No, I'm just kidding. That is not what we are doing. I just want to let you in on a little bit of the context and how I am approaching this. It's the storyline in Deuteronomy that really drew me to this place for this time within Wellspring's story. And it's this narrative that I hope that we'll be able to draw a little bit of wisdom from and maybe some inspiration for our time and place. In the story of Deuteronomy, the people of Israel are primed to enter this new land under new leadership. But did you realize that the people who wrote and edited Deuteronomy in the form that we have it now were actually people who had lost all of this? The first 5 books in the Old Testament are called the Torah, and oftentimes they're referenced as the books of Moses. And so the tradition had it that Moses wrote all of these books, but scholars don't really believe that this is accurate. Many scholars believe that a chunk of Deuteronomy was written during Josiah's reform. So Josiah is the king. That's the very last king that is ruling before the destruction of the temple and before the exile. And the bulk of this book is actually written from the exile. So that means that while the people were writing down this story, the Israelites had come into the promised land, they had possessed it, they had flourished it, they governed themselves, they built a beautiful temple to worship their God, and then they witnessed it all destroyed, violently taken away from them. So, what is fresh in their minds and a daily reality that they are living through is destruction and loss of their homes and their places of worship and their community. They've seen destruction and they know loss of a magnitude that's even hard for us to wrap our brains around. And they've been scattered. They know the promises of God, and they're trying to make sense of their circumstances, wrestling with why this has happened to them. So as we read Deuteronomy, we are watching them struggle with who God is and who they are in relation to God, as they've gotten everything that had been promised to them, only to lose it. So, in the ancient Near East, the cultures there, people really attributed everything, every success and every tragedy, to an act of a god. When nations would go to war with each other, they really thought that it was the gods that were warring against each other. And when one tribe was victorious over another, they really thought that that meant their God was more powerful than the God of the other tribe. So during the exile, the Israelites have been defeated. So where do they go with that? I think that's one of the blessings of digging into the Old Testament, because these questions, this wrestling, speaks to us as well as we encounter those thorns in our rose bush. How do we make sense of loss and hardship? So, for the Israelites, in the way that they had conceived of God, they could go a few different ways. Either their God really wasn't as strong as they thought that he was. He couldn't even protect his own home. The temple was destroyed. So he either wasn't strong enough, or maybe he didn't care about them anymore, or he didn't love them, or they were no longer favored. Or they had not held up their end of the deal. Interpreting their devastation, which was not a prediction of something that was to come, but was a harsh reality that they were living in the middle of daily, interpreting this as punishment in a crazy way is kind of a hopeful way to conceive of God when you put yourselves in their shoes. Because then God still loves them. God is still good and powerful and in control, and all they need to do is remember to turn to God and to recommit to the covenant promises, and once again, God's favor will shine upon them. I want to read this little bit from Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 5, and I think that you can get a little taste of this hope even in the midst of these curses. When all these things have happened to you, the blessings and the curses that I have set before you, if you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, and you and your children obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, just as I am commanding you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, gathering you again from all the people among whom the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if you are exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land that your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. So how hopeful is that to the ears of people who have been scattered throughout the diaspora? Remember, and then God will remember you, pull you back together, restore your community. So I hope that this gives you just a little bit of context to some of the scary that we read in Deuteronomy. This inspiration, though, for this series stems from the story in Deuteronomy. Moses is speaking to the people who are gathered on the brink of the promised land, and they are about to get everything they've been waiting and wanting and wandering for. But Moses can't take them any further. Deuteronomy contains Moses' farewell discourse. So, what wisdom did Moses feel that he needed to bestow upon these people that he's been leading for 40 years before they go forward without him? What was most important for them to know? It seems the answer is you have what you need to be successful if only you remember these things. In his farewell address, Moses tells and retells the story and encourages the Israelites to continue telling and retelling the story. Remember when God delivered you from bondage in Egypt. Remember the manna that God provided and taught you that you cannot live on bread alone. Remember the Lord your God who gives you the strength to be prosperous and to establish the covenant made with your ancestors. Remember. For Moses, the success or failure of the Israelites seems to hinge on how well they will remember and not forget. The thing that really inspired me about this, though, is that as Moses is recounting these things and he's saying, remember when this happened to you, and remember when this happened to you, those things didn't actually happen to most of the people who were gathered. Most of the people who had been eyewitnesses to the Exodus had died within that 40 years of wandering. They would not enter into the land that had been promised. The new generation that had been gathered would. And so Moses was standing in front of people and saying, remember when this happened to you, and this happened to you, and this happened to you. He wasn't saying, remember when this happened to your ancestors, but to you. By remembering the stories of the ancestors became the stories of those who were hearing. It became as if they were their very own experiences. Do your families have stories that you retell and retell and retell over and over again? My family, we're storytellers, and there are a few that probably almost every time we get together, somebody brings some reference up to a story, and we laugh and we remember. And these stories really just kind of fuse us together as a family. Some of these stories, as they're told and retold, become so vivid that even if they happened when you were too young to really actually remember it for yourself, or maybe you weren't even there to be an eyewitness, you've heard it often enough that the story becomes your own. It's like you were actually there. At Wellspring, I love how you say, enter the story where you are able. What a loving gift that we can offer to each other in community. Enter the story where you are able. We don't all think the same way about things. We have not all walked the same paths, but we are each invited to enter into the story where we are able, and we will find room. So during this series, we are going to intentionally enter into the Wellspring story, and each of us have our own entrance points. As the story is told and retold, as we remember together, my hope is that we will remember, that we will pull together as a community, and your stories will become our story. As Moses told and retold of deliverance and sustenance and promise, as he encouraged people to remember and to tell these stories again and again and again, even in the new land that they would enter, their ancestors' stories became their own as if they had personally experienced them. So some of you here have been here from the very beginning, and you have experienced every single step along the way. Others have found your way into the community at various points, being drawn here for a variety of reasons, each with your own call stories to share. I am brand new to this community with a journey and a call of my own. And as we merge, I find such hope in this Deuteronomy story. I long for the day when your stories begin to feel like my story. And that is my hope for this series, that your stories will become my story, and that by remembering, our stories will unite us and draw us together as a community. So, as with any journey, there are highs and lows, and there are ups and downs, and I think there's value in remembering all of it. So I invite you now on a journey of remembering. During this series, each week I plan on just setting the stage a little bit, and probably next week I won't talk as long. I just thought I needed to kind of set the stage on how do we deal with some of the ways that God is talked about in Deuteronomy. But I'm really just going to try to provide us with a basic framework, and then I plan on turning it over to you so that you can tell your stories and we're just going to let the conversation go wherever the Spirit will lead. This week, I thought that we might start at the very beginning. It's a very, very good place to start. And remember our origins. So, as we remember the stories of where we came from, we can see how the Spirit has guided us along the journey. We remember where we have come from and why we have formed, and then we can find purpose and we can discern wisdom so that we can vision into our future. So that's what we'll do today. Let's be in a time of remembering. How did Wellspring come to be? What do you remember about that time? What resistance did you encounter? What challenges did you face? What were your hopes and fears? And if you weren't here from the very beginning, what do hearing these stories, what kind of impact does that have on your journey? So that's where we are. Let's remember.